We have 6 people in the panel right now, and they're on three continents and the subcontinent of India. Good morning, Nicole.
Hey, thanks, Liz.
Yeah, the gang's all here. So
Great.
So we're going to have a rock'em sock'em discussion about Martin Luther today, and Tim Holmes as the modern Martin Luther. And
awesome.
And so the first thing I'm going to do in order to make this easier for people to watch later on the replay is I'm going to put Tim's 95 Theses compared to side by side with Martin Luther's, and I'm going to put each page, there's about 7 theses per page on this PowerPoint. I'm going to put each page on the screen for about 5 seconds. Okay, the purpose of that is so that later on when people are looking at the video, if they want to see what the specific theses are, they'll be able to go back and stop their video and they'll be able to see the 95 theses. So that's going to take about 2 minutes, but I'm going to share my screen now so that we get through it, and then I'll stop that and come back to you all. Meanwhile, I'm hoping some others will join us. But okay, so can everybody see that on your screen?
Yeah.
Page
Yep.
1.
Clearly,
okay.
yep.
All right, so page 1, and I'm going to start my stopwatch here, and I'm going to give each page 5 seconds. Okay, so here's page 2.
So the point of this is not to be able to read them, but just so that it's recorded on the video, so people later on can stop if they want to read them.
Righto.
So Luther is on the right.
Yep. Holmes on the left, Luther on the right.
And if you've been really aware of all this numinous thing for me, you know that one of the things I wanted to do is change my name. And so the label at the top is Terrell. But I realized at some point that, you know, I can't change my own name. It's the community that has to change my name. So it doesn't matter what I call myself. What matters is what other people call me.
Right.
So there we go. That's 95.
Okay. So I'm going to put, I'm putting the, so let me bring you all back for a moment. Nice smile there.
What did you say, Nicole?
I was, years ago, I tried to change my name when I was 25, and it didn't work. I had to take it back, and but now I've kind of come full circle with it, because I call myself Nicole, but people used to always call me Nikki, and it never felt right. Anyway, now I insist that people call me Nicole.
Oh, you do? Okay.
And it's really been, really been helpful. Like even my own family members found it quite confronting when I said, "Can you please call me Nicole? Because that's my name." Mm-hmm. They were like, "What?" And it was, but they took it on board, and it has been a really powerful process. Yeah.
So meanwhile, I'm glad you cleared that up, because you've signed a number of emails to me, Nick.
I know.
And
Nick, I know, I like Nick.
Okay.
But you want to be called Nicole.
Well, yeah, but like, I just don't want to be Nikki.
Oh, you don't want to be Nikki.
I don't want to be Nikki. And I wanted to, like, Oh, it's a big long story, but anyway. Nicole is my name. That was the name I was christened with, and that, you know, and that's on my birth certificate. So it was a thing. Yeah. And I did try to change my name by deed poll and all that stuff, but then it didn't eventuate.
Well, my name is Donald, but that name has been sort of run through the mud lately. So I prefer to stick with Skip.
Yeah, right.
Good move.
Good Lord, God help us. Okay, so
so my idea is that we'll just read a few of these, and then I kind of want to get into the discussion of the greater principle of the whole thing, which is, you know, the purpose of writing these and what it's about and who it's addressed to and stuff like that. I think that's a much more fruitful discussion than talking about each one. But we could start with how they compare.
okay, a few of them, and people can on their own time go back to the beginning of this video, and all 95 of them were put up there for about 5 seconds each, so you can go back and look at them. But I'm going to share again the first 5, and so here they are.
So this was, you know, Luther was a monk who was kind of irritated with the Catholic Church, and particularly with the sale of indulgences, which is a kind of cheesy way of raising money and absolving people of their sins at the same time. So that's what his subject was. So I'm going to read the first 5 of his to begin with. Number 1, when our Lord and Master Jesus Christ said, repent, from Matthew, he willed the entire life of believers to be one of repentance. 2, this word cannot be understood as referring to the sacrament of penance, that is, confession and satisfaction, as administered by the clergy. 3, yet it does not mean solely inner repentance. Such inner repentance is worthless unless it produces various outward mortification of the flesh. 4, the penalty of sin remains as long as the hatred of self, that is, true inner repentance, namely till our entrance into the kingdom of heaven. And 5, the Pope neither desires nor is able to remit any penalties except those imposed by his own authority or that of the canons. So that's just enough to give a sense of what he was irritated about. And of course, it goes on in a great amount of detail. But I'm going to read my 5, which are a complaint against the dominant culture rather than the church in particular, but are similar in tone. Number 1, we are called to live lives directly related to our environment. 2, our values arise from the divine within and are not those exemplified by the dominant culture. 3, this direct life refers to the immediate life of the body, not the life in years to come. 4, we are loved for who we are, not for how well we adhere to the expectations of the dominant culture. 5, although we affirm our Constitution, or what democratic declaration applies, our moral strength comes from the divine. So a couple of items of explanation there. I'm referring to the dominant culture because, for one thing, we don't really have a central authority. Like in Luther's time, 500 years ago, the central authority was the church. And of course, there was a political authority that people lived under, the king or the emperor or whoever it was that was kind of the local government. In our case, because of globalization, the boundaries between nations have, to a large degree, vanished. And so what I'm railing against is the dominant culture. Or in the word of Black Elk, who's the 19th century Lakota spiritual elder that I've referred to a number of times, Black Elk called the European culture that was overtaking his part of the world, which is not too far from where I live, he called that culture the Wasishu. And unlike our term for racial groups, it had nothing to do with the color of the skin. It was about the culture of those who take. And so Wasishu is the name that I prefer for the dominant culture, because it's not really about American way of life. I live in Montana. I've been an American my whole life, but there is a kind of global capitalist culture that has spread around the world that we're all fairly familiar with. And it has different colors and different tones in different countries. But for the most part, it is the culture of the Wasishu. We have turned into a people that takes. And my major complaint is that we have situated ourselves in such a way that we're spending our time grinding nature into money. That's what the Wasishu culture does. And so a lot of my complaints is against that culture. Maybe we'll go to some of the later theses later on. But first of all, I feel like I just want to launch into this point that the church that Luther was railing against had a central authority, and it was really centered around the Pope. And the similarity between what he is doing and what I'm doing and encouraging everybody else to do is to really examine the cultural system that we live under, and to try to examine it with a critical sense of how that relates to our own feeling of what is morally superior. So of course, in his time, it's the Pope that decides what is morally superior. And part of what Luther was trying to do was say, you know, Mr. Pope, things are not going as you have determined they should be going. So he was kind of trying very gently to say to the Pope, this is not how the Christian church is to be run. So there are some of his theses that have to do with Christians that start with the phrase, Christians are taught that. And what he's trying to do very gently is to say, this is what the tradition is about that is not being upheld by the current administration. And unfortunately for him, he pissed off the Pope anyway and got excommunicated. Fortunately, he didn't get burned, which was a real possibility. But for me, I have no, I'm in no danger of being burned by anybody. And fortunately, I'm not important enough to raise any hackles by the Pope or anybody else. But what's different about what I'm doing is there is no central authority. And it occurs to me that the closest I can get to determining the center of the dominant culture is that it has really three components, one of which is capitalism, another is democracy, which I think all of us live in democratic systems, all of us on this um, this panel. And the third one is decency, which is just a kind of a tradition that has no culture, has no boundaries. And it seems to me as though those three things are what influences what it's okay for us to do as human beings to each other. So how do you make a complaint against a system where there's no center? I didn't really address that. I just am sort of making a screed against everything, against everybody. I'm just raising my voice. And this is, I think, what we have to do if there is a central authority, like, for instance, in the U.S. democratic system, we have a constitution, and every citizen is supposed to follow the Constitution. And when the president doesn't do that, all bets are off. So what becomes the next center of guidance if the Constitution is called into question? Well, in our system, it's the Justice Department. And it just so happens that our Attorney General, the head of the Justice Department, is also in, how would you say this? He's become a puppet of Trump. And Trump himself is, I think, kind of a puppet of Putin. I mean, there's no real center to this bizarre situation that we find ourselves in. So in America, in the US, I should say, because as I've been reminded by my South American friends, America is the whole hemisphere. It's not just the northern part. In the US, if the Constitution is wiggly and the Justice Department isn't making any attempt to try to rein in that wiggliness, it comes down to the voters, who are the ones who are going to decide what kind of a system we live with. So this is going to be a huge election that's coming up. And it is not at all certain that the people that vote are going to be reflected in the results. We just don't know. And I know that in India, there's a similar situation going on. The same with Brazil. There are places like Poland, Russia, Hungary, where they pretend to have a democracy, but it's no such thing. It's really an authoritarian government, and that's what the US is headed toward. Okay, so if that's the situation, how do we as a community decide to live with each other? And to me, this is what the whole point of the 95 Theses is. I am a moral being who is placed on this earth at a certain time, and I have to respond to the charge that I'm given by the divine voice in my life. And unlike in Luther's time, 500 years ago, the church at that point had a center focus, which was there was only the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And now the whole Protestant world is very broad, and I think there are more Protestants than there are Catholics. Maybe somebody can remind me if that's true. But in any case, there's no center. And the Pope doesn't speak for all Christians. The Pope speaks for a certain sector of the Catholic Church, some of which are not listening to him. So where do you go to get authority in this world? And I think part of our job as citizens in a globalized world is to call that question into the forefront of our thinking. How do we respond as moral individuals to to a world that is so disorganized. So I think about addressing those 3 points: capitalism, democracy, or as I mentioned in the thesis number 3, I think it was, whatever political system you live under, wherever you are, whether it's democracy or not, there is a political authority there. And then the third one, decency, which has no description. It's just, how do we treat each other? And so I think each one of these needs to be addressed. I want to talk a little bit about capitalism. It arose in, I believe, I think the Dutch came up with capitalism in the 15th century or something like that. And it's spread around the world. And now America kind of gets to own capitalism, or the U.S., I should say, gets to own capitalism because we have the big, huge media companies and the advertisers that spread it around the world. And when it gets picked up by China, they sort of use our model and they turn it into a communist model. And in other countries, the same thing happens. It's sort of a reflection of the capitalism of the US. But in that world, who's the authority? Well, it comes down to, again, national law that constrains capitalistic activity. But of course, that just becomes a race to the bottom. So if you're a shipping magnate, you want to register your ship in Panama because Panama has the least constraints on laws. So every time you see a ship run aground or get an oil spill or crash into a dock somewhere, it's a Panamanian ship, even though none of those ships have ever been to Panama. They just register their papers there. And the reason is because the taxes are low and the laws are very lax. And so in any kind of a capitalist world, and Skip, you can correct me if I get out of line here, but in the
with the 100% so far,
it seems to me that capitalism is constrained by the least responsible country that is after the tax money, really, or the registration fees or whatever it is that allows an international corporation to locate somewhere else. So you get places like St. Thomas, where corporations decide to open a post office box, and that becomes their international headquarters because they don't have to pay taxes there. Or places like Ireland, I understand there are certain kinds of corporations that make their home there. Or Delaware, for instance, in the US, is where the big banks have their corporate headquarters because, again, the state of Delaware doesn't require as much taxes as they would if they registered in a place like Montana, for instance. So there's no constraint on the activity of big businesses. And of course, a small business, you don't have the luxury of working in a globalized environment, even with the internet. I mean, I'm kind of a small business, but all I can do is, run around my town and try to drum up interest in my art, or, put some stuff in a car and drive somewhere, but I can't just market it all over the world like a big corporation can. And of course, any kind of a small business, a restaurant or hair salon or whatever, they're just basically a local business as the capitalist world started being to begin with. So then the next locus is the political system. And those two are kind of intertwined because in this country, the corporations are bound by U.S. law, which is rooted in the Constitution. But of course, if there's some environmental regulation or a labor law that a company doesn't like, they just move overseas. They can go to Mexico or China or any place that has lax labor laws or environmental regulations, and they can set up shop there.
Or as we know that now, as we've now learned, they can simply ignore it. They simply ignore the law. And then you're forced to go to court, and they can force you to spend 10 years in court. And so if you have millions of dollars to go to court and go through the appellate process, then you may or may not ever get the result you want. But the powers that be are the powers that be, and they include the investment banks, not only the government, but the banking system in Wall Street and around the world too.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, in the U.S., when the president flaunts the Constitution, everybody else gets to do it too. If the president doesn't uphold it and the Justice Department doesn't hold him to account, then who's to say what's legal and what isn't? So there's kind of this race to the bottom where what is legal is essentially lowered to the point of the lowest common denominator, which is whatever you can get away with. So in Luther's time, you pretty much had to keep your nose clean, because if you went against the authority, which was both the church and the state, but the church was everywhere, and everybody was connected to it. And so if you did some nasty thing, the church is going to come and find you and call you to account. In our world, that does not happen. And while a person like me can't get away with something like just avoiding paying my taxes, Amazon can get away with that. They don't have to pay taxes. There's a bunch of those big, huge international companies that don't pay any taxes. And who's going to hold them to account? So let me turn to decency, which is the idea that there is a certain standard for how we treat each other. And for most of us human beings, that comes from some kind of religious perspective. So I come from a Christian family. We've been Methodist for many, many generations. And so that's one of the places where I get my sense of what is a decent thing to do, which is beyond what the law requires. The law says you can't kill somebody, but my Christian faith says you not only can't kill somebody, if somebody does something evil to you, do a goodness in return, which is an even stricter moral example. And that becomes, for me, the root of my sense of decency. And for Kushbu, who grew up in a Hindu culture, I would assume that your sense of decency is rooted in the tradition that is given to you by the Hindu faith. And any place that we grow up, that any of us grow up, it's really the roots of the religion in that area that gives us that sense of what is a decent way to treat somebody else, that is slightly elevated beyond what the law requires. And the trouble with that in our time is that there's a very parallel crisis happening as is happening in the capitalist world, in that I can only speak with any authority on my own faith, which is Christianity. In the Christian world, essentially, if you don't like the laws that you read about in the Bible, you can go to Panama and register your ship there. So there is, I'm sure you've heard about the prosperity gospel, which is pushed by a lot of non-denominational Christians that will tell you that God rewards those who God favors with money. And if you make a lot of money, it just means that God is paying extra special attention to you, which is nothing like what the Bible is about. In fact, the Bible, both Old and New Testament, the major principle that it talks about over and over, hundreds and hundreds of times, is concern for the poor and the oppressed. And you look at mainstream Christianity as it appears in the media, you would never think that that's what Christianity is about. You look at the wars in history, you look at Hitler, who was supposedly a Christian, you look at any of the worldly kingdoms that have wielded power in the Christian world, you'll see this tendency to take what is the numinous moral system of the original religion that has now been turned into a power tool by the institution. This is why there's so much frustration with institutional churches, which I certainly understand. And perhaps you've seen in the news that in the Methodist system, which is my preferred kind of Christian flavor, there's been a great rift in the Methodist Church across the world over the gay and lesbian issue. And we'll see a conference here in the next week or two, a worldwide conference in the Methodist Church where they're going to decide what's going to happen with that. So again, there's no center to the moral system. It's just kind of been reduced to, well, what can you get away with? And so in talking about decency, especially in an increasingly secular world, the thing that haunts me is what is going to happen in 2 or 3 generations when, unlike the older generation like myself that grew up in a world that was rooted in religious cultures, young people today who are growing up in a secular world are not privy to a moral system that comes from higher up. So I spend a lot of sleepless nights thinking about what is going to inform the higher angels of our nature. If it's not religion, what is it going to be? Is it going to be simply what you can get away with? I think about a couple of instances, like, for instance, the rise of awareness of sexual abuse. Thank God this is finally happening, that for the first time in history, people who abuse other people sexually, and this is almost entirely men, are finally being called to account. And thank God that's happening, because less than scrupulous people have been able to get away with all kinds of crap for a lot of centuries and not been called on the carpet for it. And finally, we are getting to the point where this kind of universal sense of decency is calling people on the carpet. Now, let me contrast that with a tendency over the last few years for young men to go around in the cities and beat up homeless men. And I don't know what kind of a movement this is, but there are videos that appear on YouTube where guys just, you know, they'll get a bunch of guys together and just run around downtown and beat up some old men and film it. Okay. There's no sense of decency that is preventing that from happening. And what in 100 years is going to prevent anybody from just deciding, well, I feel like going and beating somebody up. I'll just find somebody who doesn't have a protective system of any kind, like a homeless person, and I'm just going to go beat them up. Who's to say I can't do it? You know, sure, it may be illegal in my state or my area, my city, but if I don't get caught, I can get away with it. So who's to say I can't do that? And in a culture that doesn't have a moral center that comes out of religion, for instance, don't do to other people what you don't want them to do to you, which is a religious principle that's shared by all the major religions. Without that, how are people going to learn how to be decent human beings? So I guess I want to get some responses to this. You know, we all are faced with the frustrations of growing up in this weird globalized world where we're able to talk to each other all over the world here in this meeting. And at the same time, we can't go outside because there's a threat of this pandemic. We can just form our own community of haters and bigots, like you see in, you know, these white supremacist chat rooms and stuff like that, that now has the ear of, for instance, the U.S. president. How do we form a community if we don't have a center for moral imagination? Does anybody have any ideas?
Well, that was massive, but what like I really get charged up by what you're saying, and what just comes through, what really resonates is family, a refocusing, like a re-emergence, or like if governments don't make families the center of and the starting point of what they're doing, we are just going to continue to go on this journey of postmodern atomization of everything, and no one's and the only other thing that comes to mind is like a complete revolution, where like what they did in the 60s, because it's what came to mind when you were talking earlier was about democracy. Like, I don't know, maybe this is just me, but like I kind of got to the point where I was sensing this thing of a couple of years ago of like, democracy is bullshit. It's the wild, wild west. People just do what they want. And when that happens, people get hurt and people get discriminated against and things like that. And I mean, I don't have the answer, but I'm really moved by what you're saying. And it just brings me back to like the divine and going further into it and discovering what's there for myself. Because I'm stuck in this paradigm. my life, my circumstances, my situation. I don't know how to bring it back into wholeness. But I know that that's my task. Like that's what I got to do. That's why I'm here, is to kind of go, I got nothing, nothing's working. I don't know, but here I am. Like, what do you got? Like, you know, like, and communities. Yeah, it's just, I've just got this, like, this is the second half of my life and I've got to do something important with it. You know, well, like I just feel this. Yeah, I really feel it, you know, but I don't have the answer, and I can read all the books. I can, you know, but like, oh, hello. I'll shut up now.
Oh,
that's it.
Idris, how are you?
Yes, very well. I'm enjoying the talk and the input. Three things came to my mind. One is the founding fathers trying to prevent an evil genius from usurping power, so they created checks and balances. So to whatever degree anybody in any society is able to actually help the separation of powers between three centers of government, in whichever capacity they can do, between them and their friends and them and their family and them and their society. It's amazing. Go for it. The second thing that came to my mind is about social bonds theory. So in sociology and criminology, it says that people who have very close social bonds, they tend to not do as many harm to other human beings. So they think that, oh, what will my mom think if she hears about it? What would my dad think about it? What would my, spouse or beloved or my child or my next door neighbor or the friend I'm gonna meet next month, what they will think about it? So it was kind of found that people with a lot of social, now let's assume the minimum because of pandemic and restriction and all that. I would think that in many societies, it was the beloved who actually created good ethical situation for the lover or the vice versa. Because I know a lot of people are far away from their parents, and children are powerless to hold their parents too much to account. They're also dependent on the resources of the parents. But I think it's the closest love association. Call it girlfriend, boyfriend, common law, husband, wife. I think they can actually create really a high level of standard of morality and uphold it and going forward. And just to be brief and let everyone talk, the third thing that came to my mind through your talk, and it's interesting how dear Nicole also touched on it, is the word revolution. So I study different countries very closely. I'm interested in history. And so let me start with this. The idea I'm presenting is reform is always better than revolution. By definition, reform is a step-by-step slow progress of change, proposals, acceptance, implementation, occasionally going back to what they did and then going forward. So it's like a little bit back and forth, very slow waves. And then revolution as examples of French Revolution and also the Russian Revolution of 1917. It's like a complete upheaval where the entire society wants to change every single structure that they find, every single institution from bottom up. Now, the time that we are living through right now, it's pretty dangerous because a lot of people, and this is a little bit connected to the lower parts of the brain, the fight and flight area, the reptilian area in human brain, where we make a different set of decisions if we think that we are living in crisis or an emergency is going on and there's like an all-out war. And then this prefrontal cortex where like people would make long-term, sustainable, win-win type of decisions if they're not actually in grasp of fear. So societies like India, through their independence, where there were two groups of freedom fighters in India. There are like the extremists and there are the moderates. The extremists would fight and burn and create fire and havoc, and some of them would go to prison and some would get hanged. And the moderates were headed by Gandhi and Nehru. They believed in slow reforms and negotiation and lots of talk and lots of going and back, forward and back, and giving up certain privileges and taking another and exchanging. Same with Scandinavian countries. Like, they had an option at the end of Cold War or even during Cold War. Like, there are countries that they have a mixed economy. So they didn't go completely right or completely left. But through this system of reform, they kind of try to find what's best of the both worlds and what all we can do. So if I can encourage every human being in few sentences would be, even within a family, but more so in a large society, keep checks and balances always up, lots and lots of communication. The beloved, whoever is closest to you, has access to greatest amount of information about what you're doing. And everyone should uphold their closest ones to a good standard, high standard, whether it's with a smile or joke or teasing or something, but they should show that they're pleased with certain things and not pleased with some other decisions. Even with close buddies and friends, which we usually do normally with these very regular weekly or more than like once a week meetings we do, we tease each other and all that. Sometimes we disagree and we enjoy that. And the third would be being careful and staying cautious about the word revolution and trying to more focus on reform. Because one thing about revolution is, at the end of the whole havoc, maybe the pioneers and very nice-hearted people are already dead by then, or they're very powerless. And the main ideas what started the havoc is forgotten, and they were actually not being implemented at all. So French Revolution failed for that. It's like, it's possible after that much suffering, if usually any revolution will involve lots and lots of destruction. It is possible that the bad forces would come to the helm and not the good forces. So it is very easy, especially for a lot of population who don't know the revolutions of different countries and what it brought to them, to simply use it, because on a personal level, revolution is holy, it's spiritual. At times we just shake off certain chains that bind us and we become a bigger person. But on a social level and societal level, I think we should use the word reform. So kudos to you that you have taken a beautiful step.
Oh, thanks. Well, that's very well thought out. And listening to you, I'm reminded that Nicole mentioned the family, and I really do believe that we learn how to cooperate in a family, and especially if you've got brothers and sisters. You know, everybody knows that one person gets to cut the cake and then the other person gets to choose the peas. And so we learn how to be fair with each other. And families are universal. And so it's such an important way to learn how to cooperate with other people. And unfortunately, the families are dissolving as well. I'm looking at the panel, and maybe Miles and Skip are two examples of sort of a regular sort of traditional family structure, and the rest of us are loose.
I agree, yes.
And so, I hear a lot of talk from the conservative end of the world saying, oh, we need stronger families. Well, I totally agree with that, but you can't legislate that. You can't just tell people, oh, go out and have a family and everything will be fine. We have to live with the world that we're in. And one of the things that I started to gain a lot of hope about was the Arab Spring, when these spontaneous social media driven revolutions looked like they might be producing more democracy in the world. And I started working on a thing that I call democratic globe, which is an idea. I spent probably a year of my time working on this idea that has to do with each individual becoming a citizen of the world, and recognizing that in a globalized world where boundaries of all kinds are dissolving, we all have access to the internet, or hopefully we have access. And so it seems to me that the moral inspiration that Lincoln referred to as the better angels of our nature, that thing comes from the divine, and the only receptor for the divine is the human heart. And so it's not a government or a corporation or any kind of a collective that can say this is what's moral. It's the human heart that says what is moral. And it seems to me that we can create a system that is based on the numinous experience of people around the world. I'll put a link on the chat for this website I put together on the democratic globe. And the idea is that that in a world where the boundaries really don't make any difference, citizens with human hearts and a sense of fairness could conglomerate and could create a kind of a critical mass like we see in the Me Too movement, which is a global phenomenon, has nothing to do with boundaries. It has to do with particularly women who say, okay, we are going to take charge of this, and we have a vision for the better angels of our nature, and this is how it can unfold. And this happens across the globe, and it happens basically through the internet. And I think there is a way to structure a thing like that actually does have a moral center. There's a thing that I ran across called I think it's called the Global Values Survey, that you can, it's on that Democratic Globe website. There's a link to it. There's not just one, I think there's a number of them, where people are surveyed about what is important to them. And so it's kind of a way of aggregating a society's moral imagination. And this is what is lacking in all the systems that we know about. What we need is something like the idea of the democratic globe, where people become world citizens, to create movements or revolutions, kind of like the Me Too movement, that is a grassroots spontaneous eruption of our higher natures.
Yeah, larger and larger network and communication definitely helps. I think there is wisdom in community. People who are alone might go through extremes of imagination, but usually I have found, like, when there is 3 people or more in a room, the content is really like to the best side of wisdom, not to the worst side. Assuming wisdom has any worse side, but community is good.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Miles.
I'll chime in. One of the things that I have a differing opinion on is, you said that Trump is a pawn of Putin, and the United States and Trump is not the pawn of anyone. And I just posted a link.
Yep.
The United States has 95% of all the foreign bases. So your country has more bases off of U.S. territory than all the other countries. 95% of them are of American. You've got Russia surrounded. You've got China surrounded. And I post the link just so you can checked me out because it's the Representative Rick Pocan talking about this, and things like, why does the United States military need to buy 2,000 F-35 fighter jets at a ridiculous amount of money when you already have way more fighter jets than anybody else? So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. Now, secondly, on the American penny, I think you have "In God We Trust." Is that correct? It's on the penny?
I think it's on,
And
I think it's on all the money.
Yeah, it's
Is
on
it on all
all,
the money?
all currency. Sure. Sure it is.
so, you know, one of the things that I noticed, Skip was on Paul Vanderklay's Saturday video where he does his dress rehearsal for his Sunday sermon at his Calvinist church in Sacramento. And Skip, because there's somewhere along the line, there's this question, a rhetorical question, well, where are we going, or where are we being taken? And Skip said, yes, that is a good question, Paul, where are you taking us? And it is like, there's this in this God that we need to trust. We need to agree that not any one religion's got the corner, has the market cornered on God, right? And following Paul Vanderklay for the longest time, he's always like bringing it around, like, okay, there's only our Christian God that is the only one that's going, it's the true God. So that's where this Jung concept comes in, right? And being broad-minded, like the Bhagavad-Gita that we're learning about. And if you quoted to Paul Vanderklay that you're doing that series, and so I'll just summarize that we do have God. Like I have in Canada, I brought this out. It's our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it's very fine print. But the opening statement is, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. So it'd be interesting to know what Nicole has down there in Australia, if there's any such reference to God, but at least we have that to begin with. And I'll, if I may, just one more point to make. There is a pastor who I was following and I was quite enamored with, Ravi Zacharias. Do you know him? He just passed away. Now, sadly, he encountered a lot of controversy in his last years of his life. And I'm not going to go into that. You can just Google him and you'll find some of this stuff. But nevertheless, he said something that impacted me and still rings true. And he said, he declared that love is the supreme ethic. And so even though this gentleman was possibly a very failed person at times, ethically, morally, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but you know, there's all this stuff that's written about him. Nevertheless, yeah, love is the supreme ethic. So if we could get God into everybody's mind, that it's God is love, whether you're Christian, Hindu, or Sam Harris. Anyway, I'll pause. Thank you.
Well, I just want to respond. I think you're absolutely right that, you know, the divine has to be the source of morality. I'm thinking of the UN Charter for Human Rights is the only document that I know of that really has wonderfully high principles that doesn't refer to religion and I don't think it mentions God. But here is a document that we can all get behind, all of us human beings, whether or not we have a professed religion. You know, even atheists and agnostics have to have some kind of a system that they, you know, that refer to when they think about getting along with other people. And
does the UN thing, does the UN thing mention love?
I don't remember. Again, I've got a link to it on the on this global Democratic Globe site. I haven't looked at it in a long time, but I'm very impressed with it, and it's the kind of thing that could provide a non-religious focus for international moral standing. The Canadian one that you talked about, Miles, is probably a really good example of that. It takes some serious, very compassionate people to put that kind of thing together. I also wanted to respond to your comment about the Russian influence. Part of the problem with what's going on with the American election is the principle of democracy, really depends on honest dialogue, honest behavior. And what the Russians are giving us is they're throwing a wrench into the system, and they're doing this with elections all over the world. Putin is really trying to take down the idea of democracy. And so all he has to do is hire a bunch of people to screw up elections around the world. And it doesn't really matter who wins. All that matters is that it's not the voters who are making the decision. And that's what I worry about. I think you're absolutely right that the US has military bases all over everywhere. And that's really something I'm not proud of. But we should be able to design a system where one vote makes its way to the vote counters and not be hijacked along the way by some internet hacker. That's a real problem with the US election, and it's increasingly a problem with elections all over the world. So, maybe we're past democracy. I don't know. I hope not. I hope we can regain that trust and that sense of fairness.
Well, I'm a little more optimistic than you are, I think, Tim, on these things. But I'm skeptical that having a set of rules, regardless of how compassionate and how well-meaning they are, is going to provide the ultimate result that we want. And I think that Dr. Jung offered a different way of thinking about it. And he basically lived this through his life. And as you know, Khushbu and I have been reading the Bhagavad-Gita, and Khushbu has taught me that the Bhagavad-Gita is about duty and the duty of every individual to contribute to society. And one of the ways we can think about it is what I'm doing going to inure to the benefit of my grandchildren or not? Will my grandchildren reap the rewards of this? And what Eastern thought has done forever with the idea of karma is that karma, if you create bad karma in the world, it's going to follow you through four generations. So it'll be much worse than your grandchildren. It'll be to your great-grandchildren too. And throughout my life, I've had people who have wronged me one way or another. I've wronged a few as well, I suppose. But what I found is that I don't need to do anything to have revenge, because karma takes care of that 100%. And, because, some of the things that have been pulled on me, if they were pulled on a less tolerant man, would result in murders. and so I never bother with what things are done to me with the perpetrators, because they will get theirs in the end. They do get theirs, and they get it to the third generation. I just want to share with you that one of the things that Dr. Jung talked about, and it's right in the Red Book, and we haven't noticed it much up until now, but because Kushbu and I are reading the Bhagavad-Gita right now, I'm showing you here page 154 of the Red Book. And so as you can see, around this picture is all of Dr. Jung's handwritten German calligraphy of the messages that he had. And this image is Philemon, who is, for all practical purposes, God from the point of view of Dr. Jung, or the self. And next to it here are these words. The Bhagavad-Gita says, whenever there is a decline of the law and an increase in iniquity, then I put forth myself. Wait a minute. Okay, I'm going to read this out of the Bhagavad-Gita, since I have three of them in front of me. This is in discourse number 4, verses 7 and 8 of the Bhagavad-Gita. Indeed, whenever there is a decay of righteousness and growth of unrighteousness, I incarnate myself, O descendant of Bharata. I reincarnate across the ages in order to give protection to the righteous and to destroy the unrighteous for the reinstatement of righteousness. And so,
and I think Rishi said that was her favorite verse.
Right, she did. And it's also the verse that Ashok Beatty was referring to when we talked to him a few weeks ago. Although he gave the wrong citation. He mentioned the citation Discourse 5, 7, and 8. Discourse 5, verses 7 and 8, but it's actually Discourse 4, 7, and 8. And it's the same quote as we were just looking at. And so the point is that God does incarnate, and it doesn't matter what you believe, what your God image is, what you think of God is, because God does incarnate and fixes things. And so Dr. Jung wrote those words probably in the midst of World War I, and he knew that righteousness would prevail. But it takes time. It's not something that we can just put down on a nice document and everybody will say, yeah, let's go like this. But over longer periods of time, God does manifest. And so what do I mean by God? Okay, well, what I mean is what Dr. Jung referred to, which is the unconscious. And he finally admitted that that's what he was talking about in his letter to the Reverend David Cox, which I've read a few times in various contexts. But the basic idea is that if we take the United States as a collective unconscious, then there is a sensibility of what we are as a country, to include those that we don't agree with. And we will do things that are bad or good, but the right answer ultimately emerges. And that's the secret sauce of the United States, as I've said a few times, that we have people from every source, every religion, every race, every national origin who are now Americans in the United States. And that's the strength of our country, because whenever any of those groups comes up with a good idea, we adopt it. But any bad idea gets pushed out of the system. It's a process like tempering steel. And so if the collective unconscious of America sees that things are pretty bad and they need to change, then our erstwhile president will be blown out of office. But if enough don't see it, or if the people that are in charge of elections cheat us in our elections, then he won't be blown out of office, but then things will get worse. And the worse they get, the more there will be need for a return to an equilibrium. Now, when we can easily see that the training of duty, as in the Bhagavad-Gita, which is about that, cannot necessarily, and morality cannot necessarily force it upon us. I remember when the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, President Johnson decided at noon one fine day or something like that, that he would stop all deferments of being drafted until at midnight that night for marriage. Okay, in other words, people, if they got married before midnight, they could avoid being drafted. But if they didn't get married before midnight, then they were up for the draft. And this was in 1964, in August of 1964. And what really shocked me was that instantly there were lines of people around courthouses all over the United States of people trying to get married so that they could avoid serving. Now, for me, because I was raised in the idea of service and duty because of my father being a naval officer, I just couldn't understand that. And I couldn't get my mind around it. And, it never occurred to me not to serve. It was the family business. And even over the next 4 years as I was in college, it never occurred to me. And indeed, I was commissioned on my graduation day from college. But I went to what is lately called a little lefty college. And so a lot of the people didn't want me to serve, and I had to be very steadfast in my view of my duty. And ironically, those guys are all now very far right compared to me. I'm the most left-wing person I know out of my class, with the exception of Mike Berkowitz, who we met. a couple weeks back. Mike's a little bit farther out there on the left, but not that much. He and I are of a piece. And so my thought about this is that, although it's very difficult, I mean, I really chafed at the idea that Dr. Jung was building this house behind me during the 20s and 30s, when the country or the world was between the two world wars. And I said to myself, why didn't he do more to fix things? Because he could have. He was very connected with high-ranking Germans. He was not, as people argue, that he was a Nazi. That's not true at all. But he could have influenced people, in my opinion, as I went along in my study of Jung. But in the fullness of time, I've realized that he realized that there was not anything that he could do in terms of actually convincing people. And politicians don't convince. What convinces people is when their ox is gored, when their son dies in the battle. This is one of the reasons why I resist what George Bush did, which was to hide all the bodies coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and not let the country see what the cost was of those wars, because obviously in Vietnam there was no hiding it, and every small community had somebody killed in Vietnam, and so it was very obvious, and so it is with this virus right now. Okay, the president can say anything he wants about himself and what he may or may not have done, but there's very soon, if it's not the case already, very soon, there are going to be people in every family of the world that will know others, members of their family or others that have died from coronavirus. And everybody's going to have an opinion about that and what it means for the future. And so, do I think that we can organize? I mean, I used to be very idealistic and think that we should get people to follow the rule of law and so forth. But now I see that the rule of law is just being trampled. And so it is our own duty that's going to make the difference. And somehow we have to educate our young people to understand what their duty is and what their responsibilities are, not only for themselves, but for their community and so on. And
it makes me think about the object of duty. So, for instance, after 9/11, George Bush said, basically your duty is to go out and shop to the U.S. citizenry.
right.
And I contrast that with the very felt duty that this is before my time, but during the Second World War, there were things like, metal drives where people would bring out their pots and pans from their kitchen to contribute to the war effort. And that, to me, signified a kind of duty to the collective that we haven't seen since then. And
Right.
I'm not even sure that that's possible anymore, just because we are so disunited. And so, you know, I'm listening to you talk about the, you know, your duty to the country during the Vietnam War. And my feeling at the time was that my duty is to something greater than the, you know, the political structure. That I felt like my duty was to the principles of the Constitution. And I totally agree with you that we are hungry for a sense of duty. And I love the idea of, like they do in Switzerland, you know, everybody gives 2 years to the country.
Right. In Israel too. And you know, my best friends that I've known for the longest time in my life, one of them I've known since 1962, did not serve, okay? And in the fullness of time, I highly respect the position they took, including one man who went to Canada to escape being drafted, and his father had been the staff secretary to the Commander Naval Forces Japan. But this young man, you know, we were 20 at the time, he went to Canada and never came back. And yet, to this day, he's my closest friend because because he and I have been through so many things together, and we were separated for 30 years. We didn't see each other for 30 years of the, what, close to 60 years since I've known him. But, you know, he saw what his duty was, okay, and never mind what motives might have existed at any given time, but he couldn't stand what the country was doing. And I didn't like it much either. I really didn't, because in 1962, my father showed me what was wrong with the Vietnam War, told me on the dock in Yokosuka, Japan. He took me out to the dock one evening, and there was a line of ships going out of Tokyo Bay. And he said, you see that, Skip? And I said, yeah, Dad. He says, that's the Marines. They're going to Vietnam. And then he said, every person in the military has either been to Vietnam already, is there now, or is going there. This was in 1962. And I said, why, Dad? And he said, well, because the generals have to get their medals in order to have their career. And he was right. And so I was always very doubtful about the Vietnam War per se from that time. And officially, the Marines didn't enter the Vietnam War until March the 7th, 1965, which was when the publicity picture was taken. But they were actually there for 2.5 years before that. And so all these things bubble in a country, you know, in a world now that has 7.5 billion people or 8 billion people, and in our country that has 330 million or so. All these things are bubbling up and down in our psyches all the time, and it's gotten harder to see what's going on, because now with the internet, we've got a collective unconscious that's global, and I'm not sure that that's had time to stabilize in any way, but I think it will, and I think it will, and I think that you know, God is going to make it right for us. And so I no longer have to believe in God. I know God. And, you know,
I think we can count on people continuing to have a connection with the inner divine.
surely.
And it seems to me that we have passed the point in history where we can make use of hierarchical structures like the Catholic Church. And, you know, there's a great kind of theology that comes out of the Catholic Church and all other religious hierarchical structures.
Right.
But we've passed the point where that's going to be kind of the wave of the future. And now we are inexorably tied to the power of the individual. And I think this is a good thing, but we need to somehow be able to access the higher natures of our angels.
Surely.
You know? And I find myself thinking about, you know, can we just depend on people to be their own religious experts? Huh.
That was Kushbu.
You know,
Hi, Kushbu. Do you want to talk, Kushbu? Just oh, she muted herself. No, that was coming out of her little square there. Go ahead, Nicole. Kushbu will get her chance.
When you talk about the individual, I don't know, I get red flags, but what's coming through is the Me Too movement has a dark shadow because it's one of the polarities of it is the shaming of men, which doesn't help us. So it's really difficult to have a safe conversation about these issues. And the reason why Carl Jung didn't do anything and just went and lived in his house is because of that, I reckon, because he realized, and he was in a completely different political paradigm, but it might have even been more that he was aware that, you know, if you stand up, particularly as a woman today, and say something, it's really, you're putting yourself out there because someone's going to come along and say that you're crazy and take you down. And
or try to.
Yes. And this is a problem. And, you know, like I marched in the anti-Iraq war demonstrations in Sydney with my daughter and my husband, and but yeah, there's this individualism, like, because that's the generation before me. So that's my husband's generation. So but see, how do we bridge this gap of being able to have these difficult conversations with the younger people? I try to do it, but a lot of them don't listen to me and they just think that I'm some nutter.
Well, we have to educate people better, that's for sure.
Like, yeah, but like even somebody like myself, in the current political paradigm, like at the moment in Australia, we've got 2 women premiers talking, and like critical kind of situation here. And they just go into political like speak, and because they're both competing to be top, I reckon. I don't know. Like, what would I know? But everything seems to go into this funnel where it gets really critical, and then what's really meant to be happening doesn't happen. And
Well, if
yeah,
I could
it's
just say something, you know, you're promoting the concept of love, Nicole, and Tim,
yeah,
his 95 thesis, they all strike me as statements of love. And love is this really
Yeah.
nebulous word, and it's on a spectrum. And you know, but if we can, you know, agree that love is the supreme ethic, and that God is love. Jung concludes Memory, Dreams, and Reflections, correct me if I'm wrong, Skip, with a statement about love.
I'm just pulling it up here.
And so, yeah, we've got a very powerful coming together, and
yes,
take that to the community and to youth, and you know, try to get people to get off of their mindset that they've got love cornered. You know, I will very much say that I find Jesus Christ symbolic of love, but I'm now, having encountered Jung and through Skip, I'm now much more open-minded that it's not all about Jesus. So I'm going to have to conclude, and I'm going to try to listen on YouTube, but I've got to get attending to something else here. But I'll
agree
listen
with
in.
you, Miles, that it's not all about Jesus, but it is all about love.
Yes,
And,
it is.
you know, if we can't learn that lesson, we are not going to survive.
That's right.
So we
That's
need
right.
to,
Yeah.
however we get to that conclusion, we need to reach that conclusion. We need to be able to survive together, because the
Yeah.
alternative is dying together.
So, Miles, I just wanted to mention that I was just trying to get my adrenaline running with that bunch that was sparring with me on Paul Vanderklay's video. And I keep wanting to say to them, man, stop coming to a pro game with a wiffle ball bat. You have to come with real knowledge before you can start whacking this stuff out. Because every so often, once a week or so, I have to get my adrenaline running by getting into a little bit of debate, friendly debate with some of these young folks who, you know, they've got one or two slogans that they've memorized, like Christ is it, Christ is the only one. Yeah, he is. But you know, there's other things to consider too. Okay.
See, I wonder if we can hear from Nicholas.
Yeah, Nicholas.
Yeah.
Or Jing. Or Kushbu. Are you awake yet, Kushbu?
Can you hear me, guys?
Yeah, go ahead, Nicholas. Nick, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to throw a nugget in about the Me Too movement. I mean, I'm totally for female empowerment and all that stuff, and then, you know, people who are abused and stuff. But we really live in a day and age when everything really is in the presence of its opposite. And what I mean is that, I'm sure all of you know Anthony Bourdain. Anthony Bourdain, the chef. Yep. So
Yeah,
I mean, I'm kind of a fan of his, right? And
I am too.
Yeah,
Me
and
too.
the general impression of Anthony Bourdain is seriously someone who's been there, done that, and is pretty chill as a result. You know, he's been through everything. And I've met him once in Singapore, and it was really nice. And when he died, and I found out it was by suicide, I was utterly floored. I mean,
Me too.
Yeah, him dying is already, you know, surprising enough, but him taking his own life, it was up there with, okay, anyway, I was really floored by it, right? I couldn't understand it. And so I just started reading about him, reading his books, reading some news. And I was led to his girlfriend at that time, this lady called Asha Argento. And she was one of the foremost leaders of Me Too. She gave this very powerful speech at the Cannes Music, right? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, Nicole? Yeah, where, you know, she was at the Cannes Film Festival. She basically unloaded, and it was like, wow, you know. But she actually made, and she, you know, was one of the people who was abused by Harvey Weinstein and all that. But you see what happened later. It was revealed that she made a deal with Harvey, and beyond that, there was this other actor, this guy, this younger guy, whom long ago she played his mother when he was a small boy in a film, right? And she basically sexually assaulted him later on during the Me Too time.
Wow.
And it's really intense because, you know, the fact that, I mean, that as if that sexual assault isn't bad enough, but when you look at the past and that she played his mother when he was just a small boy in this movie, and, you know, it just seems very Black Widow kind of thing. And she was one of the champions of the Me Too movement, as in the foremost champion, up there with people like Rosie McGowan and stuff like that. And yeah, so I mean, I just wanted to throw this nugget in, not in any sense of like, oh, look, you know, like someone who is good is actually has this dirt. It's not like that at all. It's more that, how do I put this? I think a useful way for me is to relate it to what Idris said earlier about revolution. In the sense that, you see, revolution for, you know, we all have this revolutionary impulse, meaning that we all have this impulse that, yes, we want change, let's have it happen. But you see, on the deeper level, revolution is about unlocking energy. And so for me, it's actually not whether it's about revolution or reform, it's about alignment. Because revolution is it's bound, and I'm talking in I Ching sense here, it's bound with the time. You can't decide to have a revolution and it happened, you see. So the most we can do at each point in time is to align ourselves best. And if we don't align ourselves properly, then when energy is unlocked, you have things like this where you see a champion of such a revolutionary, potent, you know, energy releasing things such as the Me Too movement has at her DNA the exact thing that is being revolted against. Yeah, I just wanted to throw that in.
I'll have to listen back to this again because this is really sort of, because I have spoken out on social media about Me Too and being shut down and being, you know, been really freaked out by the backlash. But that's really interesting what you say. This is really making me think that I want to look into this Me Too thing deeper, like, because I only see it from an Australian perspective.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Jung was talking about the opposite of love is actually power, and the power devil. And whenever you have a revolution, even if it's something like Me Too, it can release good energy, but then if the leaders of it get taken up by the power devil, then it gets bastardized, it gets messed up.
And this, we can see this also even in, like, let's say the 60s psychedelic movement, right? In the sense of there are people in the psychedelic community, like I'll call them elders, that when they look back, they say that it was a big mistake. And the big mistake wasn't that there were psychedelics, but the big mistake was that it was, they were so pervasive and everyone got to try them. Because back in the 60s, you know, it was like, oh, you know, just turn on, tune in, drop out, or, you know, take LSD and you'll see it or what. But that was wrong, because what happened was that it released so much energy that what you had as a result was Richard Nixon. I think it was Richard Nixon at that time, just clamping down on everything, which actually stalled research for decades. So the people who look back, they say that what should have been done, or the better thing to have happened, was that prominent people in the community, be it engineers, poets, artists, politicians even, who were in so-called positions of power or more ahead in society, they should have been exposed to that experience. And I feel that this does tie in with what Dr. Jung thinks of psychedelics, which is that he said something like he wouldn't do it not because there's anything wrong with it, but because I think he used this line that unearned wisdom has a very big danger. So it is true that when you have a psychedelic experience, it will unlock, and then for that moment you will see, or let's just call it wisdom in the collective unconscious and all that. But it is not for, I feel it is not for everyone, in the sense that it is hard to integrate. And beyond being hard to integrate, it, like what Dr. Jung said, unearned wisdom is very dangerous.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great line. Unearned wisdom is very dangerous.
Well, I think the last few words of Memories, Dreams, Reflections is very telling, because I'll just give you the last phrase. To his freedom to choose between truth and error. Okay, people have to have the freedom to choose between truth and error, and obviously the power devil, when people are going for power, when they're politicians, they're going for power. When they're leading revolutionary organizations, they're going for power. Yes, they're releasing energy, but they're also going for power. And so the question is that all of us need to make a distinction between truth and error. And obviously that's what Martin Luther was doing when he was criticizing the indulgences. He said, how can this priest say that as soon as the money is in the collection box, then the soul gets out of purgatory? Baloney. Obviously that's just buying off something. And is that true? Is that truth? How's that work? But anyway, I probably should read this whole passage about love, which is how Dr. Jung ends Memories, Dreams, Reflections. So it's, I may end up reading it again sometime when Nancy's here, but for now, at this point, the fact forces itself on my attention that beside the field of reflection, now remember, one of the things that Jungian analysts are always doing is urging you to reflect on what's happening in your life, okay, to think about it. But beside the field of reflection, there is another equally broad, if not broader, area in which rational understanding and rational modes of representation find scarcely anything they are able to grasp. This is the realm of Eros. In classical times, when such things were properly understood, Eros was considered a god whose divinity transcended our human limits, and who therefore could neither be comprehended nor represented in any way. I might, as many before me have attempted to do, venture an approach to this daemon, whose range of activity extends from the endless spaces of the heavens to the dark abysses of hell. But I falter before the task of finding the language which might adequately express the incalculable paradoxes of love. Eros is a cosmogonus, a creator and father-mother of all higher consciousness. I sometimes feel that Paul's words, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, might well be the first condition of all cognition and the quintessence of divinity itself. Whatever the learned interpretation may be of the sentence, God is love, the words affirm the complexio oppositorum of the Godhead. In my medical experience, as well as my own life, I have again and again been faced with the mystery of love and have never been able to explain what it is. Like Job, I had to lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Job 40:4 and following. Here's the greatest and the smallest, the remotest and the nearest, the highest and the lowest. And we cannot discuss one side of it without also discussing the other. No language is adequate to this paradox. Whatever one can say, no words express the whole. To speak of partial aspects is always too much or too little, for only the whole is meaningful. Love bears all things and endures all things, 1 Corinthians 13:7. These words say all there is to be said. Nothing can be added to them, for we are, in the deepest sense, the victims and instruments of cosmogonic love. I put the word in quotation marks to indicate that I do not use it in its connotations of desiring, preferring, favoring, wishing, and similar feelings, but as something superior to the individual, a unified and undivided whole. Being apart, man cannot grasp the whole. He is at its mercy. He may assert it or rebel against it, but he is always caught up by it and enclosed within it. He is dependent upon it, and it is sustained by it. Love is his light and his darkness, whose end he cannot see. Love ceases not. Whether he speaks with the tongues of angels or with scientific exactitude traces the life of a cell down to its uttermost source, man can try to name love, showering upon it all the names at his command, and still he will involve himself in endless self-deceptions. If he possesses a grain of wisdom, he will lay down his arms and name the unknown by the more unknown, ignotum per ignatius, that is, by the name of God. That is a confession of his subjection, his imperfection, and his dependence, but at the same time, a testimony to his freedom to choose between truth and error. That sort of sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty profound. I'm scared.
But Tim, did we hijack your 95 theses? We got through 5 of them. Should we talk about more?
Well, sure, we could do that.
Hmm.
I wanted to maybe hit 62 and 63.
Okay, let
Bring
me
Yeah.
those up.
let me find those just a moment.
The reason why I want to highlight those, it's as I mentioned before last week, that when I put these together, I was inspired by Luther's theses, and I read through them, but I of course was on my own trajectory, and so some of the themes were inspired by Luther, but here there was one passage, that I used verbatim. So I just want to read these two. 62 from Luther. The true treasure of the church is the most holy gospel of the glory and grace of God. 63. But this treasure is naturally most odious, for it makes the first to be last, which is from Matthew. And my 62, all scriptures are true treasures. It is the task of the devout searcher to find its truth, as it is very likely not easily apparent. And 63, but this treasure is naturally most odious, for it makes the first to be last. And of course, 63 is the same on both of those. I just stole that directly from Luther. It's the only one in the whole 95 that I really wanted to keep from his. But in both of those contexts, I think it makes sense. Let's go on to the last few. I particularly want to highlight 90 and 92.
Okay, let me get to those. Let's see, I'm not in share screen at the moment. Just a moment.
So when I was putting this together, this was basically stream of consciousness for me, reading Luther's and then thinking about how I respond to my own world. And so let me just read these two from Luther, number 90. To repress these very sharp arguments of the laity by force alone, and not to resolve them by giving reasons, is to expose the church and the Pope to the ridicule of their enemies and to make Christians unhappy. And 91, if therefore indulgences were preached according to the spirit and intention of the Pope, all these doubts would be readily resolved. Indeed, they would not exist. And my number 90, each of us has a responsibility to the species to improve the lot we were given with our own ideas and love. And 91, the human heart craves ritual, and any entity that denies ritual denies the living human heart. And the reason I want to point these out is just that my supposition is that the influence of the church is so much less now than it was 500 years ago. You know, at the time when Luther was making these declarations, everybody was familiar with exactly what he was talking about. And so it was very clear that to the normal laity of the church that these issues were going on. And I think it must have been extremely clear to everybody looking at this that what he was after and what the conditions were, or the problems were. And in my case, without being able to speak to a center of power where all of these three components of the capitalist center, the capitalist power, the political power, and the center of decency, all of those are diffused. What do you rile against? And so in my case, I'm coming back to an individual and saying, you know, that each person has the authority to unfold the divine in whatever way they think is appropriate. And that ritual is an important part of that. That here in our culture, we are so terrible with ritual. It's one of the reasons I very much appreciate the Catholic tradition, because their Mass is so full of ritual, and the whole tradition, you know, is just very, very rich with 2,000 years of tradition and ritual that they have preserved. And the same with the Orthodox branch of the church. And being a Protestant, I'm really mourning that the Protestants hardly have any ritual. And even in my church, there's very little respect for ritual. It just seems like a lot of people say, you know, what's the point of that? Because it's not clear. It's symbolic, and we're terrible at fostering a symbolic life. So one of the things I think is really important is to encourage people to indulge in ritual and to unfold the truth of what they see as the divine voice in their life in a ritualistic way.
So that's
Just while I'm talking, I'm hearing the howls out here.
oh,
Every night at this time, you know, people howl out their doors and windows as a
okay.
support for the
Well, that's a ritual.
workers.
You
And
want to
that's a
go?
beautiful ritual. I love the fact that the whole city is doing it.
You want to take a minute off and go howl?
No, I don't want to miss anything.
Okay. Well, I want you to expand on the need for ritual and the symbolic life. Okay. Obviously, I understand these things in a Jungian context, but in kind of a logos kind of way. And I want you to expand on what you hope will happen at a given ritual. We're doing ritual. We're doing ritual by having these meetings and that sort of thing. And so those sort of constitute ritual, I think. But I really want to understand from your perspective why ritual is important, number one, and what the symbolic life brings to us. I mean, I know you're, as an artist, you present the symbolic life throughout your life, but.
Right. Well, it's hard to talk about the importance of ritual to a very reasonable and scientific oriented culture, because the whole trajectory of Western civilization is to get away from symbolic thinking. And we've become so enamored of the left side of the brain, the analytical, the descriptive. I'm remembering that describe, the word describe is to write out. To explain is another aspect of the reasonable civilization. And explaining is making everything on the same level, as if there was no distinction between objects. And this is a great way of understanding the world, and I'm all for the beauties of science, but at the same time, we need to honor the other side of our brain, the left or the right side of the brain, which is it's harder to describe. It's the emotional, the feminine, the artistic. And as an artist, I'm spending a lot of my time in that part of the brain. But one thing a ritual does is it speaks to the inner world in a way that our reasonable brain just simply cannot understand. So for instance, Abraham in like 3000 BC takes his son Isaac up to the mountain to sacrifice him for the sake of God. And the angel of the Lord comes down and says, okay, you don't really have to do that. All I need is to know that you have a contrite heart. And I think this is a description, there's that word again, of the point in human development when human beings began to realize that doing a ritual was just as valuable as actually taking their child and cutting their throat and putting their blood all over the altar. You don't really need to destroy your children to show your contrition. You can do it by opening your heart. But it also is not enough to simply say, okay, I opened my heart. There needs to be some kind of activity involved. And so in human history, the early Israelites learned how to sacrifice animals rather than their children. And later on, they discovered they could put the animal fat into a candle and burn the candle instead of burning the animal. And so this is why we have candles. This is why you go to a religious service and there are always candles burning, like this beautiful one I have behind me.
Mhm.
The reason why we do that is it's a ritual sacrifice. So you're sacrificing a little bit of wax. It's not very much, but it's very important that you light that candle. It has a way of opening your inner life in a way that no description can. Nothing simply of cognition is going to go to that level. So for instance, I had a dream last week, and one of the images in the dream was this nun that passed by me with a book suspended on her back.
Mhm.
And I wrote out the dream and I did a little active imagination about it. But I also decided, there's something important about this, so I want to make a book. So I happen to have a book that kind of looks like the one that was in my dream. And I discovered in the dialogue that when I asked her to explain what was in the book, what was revealed to me was it didn't matter if I read it or not because I couldn't understand it. So I made a script here.
Hold on. Okay, I want to put it on speaker view so we can see that. Okay, I see that, yes.
And you can probably see that it's just gibberish. It's just kind of a made up script.
Mhm.
And the point is, I wanted to create a book that I couldn't read. And what's the point of that? What does it do? What does it accomplish? Absolutely nothing. What it does is it makes a conversation with my inner life so that my unconscious knows that I'm taking it seriously. And when it gives me a message, I address it with real serious intent. So for instance, I have a muse, which is it's like my artistic anima, that is a very important character in my life. And when I have a project, I want to come up with some idea, I make an appointment with my muse. And I say, okay, on Tuesday afternoon from 2 to 4, I want us to sit down and think of some really good ideas for this project. And I treat that just like an appointment with you guys. When 2 o'clock comes along, I quit everything. I don't answer the phone. I sit down with my muse and I have a conversation with her. And I think it's really important to give the inner life that kind of serious attention where you unplug the phone, you don't answer the door, you're in it with your inner character just like you would be with a human being. And to me, this is the value of ritual. And in a world where we are so much stuck in our cognition that we kind of refuse to do anything that doesn't make any sense. In a situation like what we're in now with the coronavirus, I really mourn that we do not have rituals to deal with our sense of loss. And that's one of the things I'm working on right now, is making a presentation to the governor's office to create a kind of memorial that's just out in public, that doesn't do anything. It's just a big, huge black thing that people can go visit. And it doesn't produce anything, and it doesn't, increase tourism. All it does is it dwells in the middle of the community, so that when we feel like something is wrong in our lives because we can't carry on business as usual, there's a place we can go and say, well, sure enough, there it is. I can put flowers in front of it and say, thank you for acknowledging that we are all in this crisis together.
Yeah, it surely does do something. I just always think of, in terms of what you've described, I've always thought about the Vietnam War Memorial and how, things became very statistical, like they are now. Every week it'd be another 500 people killed or something like that, or we lost 100 helicopters and 500 men last week. And that was, it just attenuated the information in such a way that we didn't properly mourn. And the Vietnam War Memorial made it possible. And, to this day, every day there are piles of flowers and teddy bears and all kinds of things that people leave behind next to the Vietnam War Memorial. So it's very meaningful for people. And, I know it certainly is for me, because I always look for
your friends,
my friends that I know that are listed there. And, I never thought about how I would react when I went and found my roommate's name the first time. But, when I did find his name, I wept uncontrollably. And I can't, in a logical way, say why. I mean, I know I'm mourning his loss, but it's obviously from the Eros side, from life itself. Wonder what you think. I've never heard you react to my dictum that logos, there's nothing in logos that's alive, that it's only if you put life into it that it makes any difference.
Yes, I think art is the same way. There is nothing in art that is alive. If I show a sculpture to my dog knows exactly what it is. It's a hunk of metal that's big enough to put a hole in your car. That's all it is.
Right.
But you get a human being that comes into the room and sees this hunk of metal, and all of a sudden there's something that happens.
Oh yeah.
And that's the Eros part. That's where this meaningless, chunk of metal all of a sudden makes something happen inside of you. That's where the art is.
Yeah, I always have this in my view. This is
I like that one.
Yeah, this is a
Returning
postcard.
the nails.
Yeah, returning the nails. This is a postcard that Tim sent me, and I have his message on the back. But I always have it in my view, just if I look to the right a little bit from my screen. And, as Tim says, it would be a good murder weapon or something like that. but the first time I saw this, and I guess you know about it too, Nicole, right? This is Mary returning the nails to the Roman authorities because
after the crucifixion.
Yeah, after the crucifixion, because she was not in need of them. Her son had risen, right? And when I got this in the mail on a Saturday evening. I guess it was about 10 or 11 when I opened my mailbox and picked this up, and I read this message from Tim, and then I looked at this image, and oh my God, I was immobilized for an hour. I couldn't move because there were so many associations that came to me from that, and so, you know, I think that one thing we need to help men understand, Nicole, because this is something you're thinking about, is that all these things that we make, all these things that we think are so important, whatever it is, whether it's an automobile or a building or a sculpture, in the end, they don't have any life in them. And you know, I dig at Christians sometimes by saying that, you know, the Bible is just a black doorstop unless you put life into it. And so the ritual of going to church is what puts life into the Bible, right? And the ritual of reading the words and expressing the words and what they mean to you, it affects you in a certain way, and so we have to help men understand that it's not, Eros is actually life itself. Okay, Eros is actually life itself. That, you know, okay, we have built up civilization by all this logos, and, you know, every time, even speaking a word, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, but even once you've spoken that word is still only part of a skeleton of life. It's not life. Okay, the Word is not life. What's the Word is light and life, which Christ brought. And, you know, John 1 says this explicitly, but people don't hear it. They still don't understand it.
And I think it's perpetually hard for us to try to figure out with our brains what ritual is about.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that you know, if you think about what would it be like to have your parent or somebody who is your spouse or your child, somebody who is really dear to you, to have them die and not have a funeral. You know, there's something about that prospect that just tears my heart. It's like what the funeral does, we can't really explain, but it somehow takes this horrible event and it transforms it into something that we can find precious and meaningful. And I would say that every ritual does that in some way. It takes the mysterious and it brings it into a form where we can digest it. And it's never that we can understand it totally. You know, this is, Jung made this distinction between a sign and a symbol. And a sign is like the figure on the outside of the bathroom door that tells you if it's male or female. It encompasses everything you need to know to move forward. It gives you like a word, it gives you a sense of the meaning of something. But a symbol, on the other hand, is something that contains a bigger mystery than you can understand. And so the symbol of the empty cross, for instance, which is an instrument of torture, but it is also a revelation that God made a sacrifice for human beings that is still alive, even though the human being died. That's a
Right.
mystery that we will never be able to understand. Or
That's right.
the mystery of love that you symbolize by maybe a ring on your finger, or, you know, there are many symbols for love. It's a greater mystery than we can comprehend. But having the symbol allows us to be able to absorb something about it that we cannot absorb by simply talking about it. And this is the power of ritual. And if you think about, I'm really touched that you're so moved by the Returning the Nails sculpture. I think all of us are really, really moved by some artwork. Maybe it's Picasso's Guernica, or you know, the Burghers of Calais by Rodin, or The Starry Night by Van Gogh. We've all been very, very moved by a piece of art. And if you try to, in fact, recreate it, like I sometimes do with a great painting, I'll sit down and say, wow, this is so good, I want to make one. And I'll, you know, get out all my colors and I'll do all the brush strokes just like I'm seeing, and I cannot make the thing happen for me. I mean, the only art I can make is my own art. If it comes out of my soul, it's successful. And if I just try to reproduce Van Gogh, what came out of his soul, it's kind of like, you know, pretending to be you and not doing a very good job of it. You know, that's not my job.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that I'm always rueful about is that Christians don't even understand the first 14 verses of the book of John. And because it says right here in verse 4, you know, after saying the word was at the beginning, then it says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And so the point is not the word, the point is the life, and the light that was presented. I mean, the light of consciousness. Jesus brought a new eon of consciousness to the human species. That's what he did. And new light so people could see things in a different way. And it wasn't the word. I mean, this pocket Bible I have is just a dead thing. If it's sitting here on my desk, but if I'm reading from it and telling you what it means to me and how I see its meaning and the significance of it and the significance of this man, then it has life in it and it has light in it, and people can share that light and pass that light. And, you know, of course, there are many, you know, obviously at Christmas time we have typically a candlelight service, but also I think of Jews on the Sabbath where they light candles. I guess it's 8 weeks from now, we'll have Eid al-Adha in the Muslim world, which is, it's actually celebrating what you were talking about earlier. It's actually celebrating the end of human sacrifice, the end of sacrificing children for the sake of God. That is what it's referring to. It's referring to Abraham realizing that he didn't have to sacrifice his eldest son. And it is called the Festival of Light too. And in Hindu religion is Diwali, which is also a festival of light. And so we have to think what is the meaning of this light that we're talking about. The meaning of the light is the consciousness that we have that we can share with others.
I think it's
I
Oh,
thought,
go ahead.
oh yeah, no, I just wanted to share something about ritual. I think ritual is very important. And however, what you were saying about the funeral, the death thing, I think I'm totally with that. However, coming at it from another angle, um, I I think that's a very good example. But when I think about like funerals, I feel they're also a good example of this other thing I feel about rituals, which is maybe not about rituals per se, but what we bring to rituals, which is that I feel that there's a calcification of a lot of ritual going on. So my own personal take is that I feel that um, I'm going to give this a percentage, but don't take it seriously. I would say like 60% of ritual and things should be kept intact, and we should treat it with reverence because it provides a historical line of continuity to our deepest identity. But 40% can be thrown off without remorse or regret. And to use the example of the funeral, I remember this episode of CSI where the police department found a body missing from the morgue. So that's a very serious thing. So they went on a search for it, and they traced it to, they found it in Las Vegas. And basically what happened was a group of friends stole the body from the morgue. The guy who died was a very, very dear and good friend. And they were in this restaurant playing cards, and the dead body was there upright with a hat, and he had a beer in front of him, and all his friends were like, hey, you were talking to him and even, poking him, but it was a dead body. And what I saw in that was I don't know, it was a celebration of life, I felt. So in terms of the funeral, I'm just thinking that yes, funerals are important, but at the same time, I see funerals as also an occasion to celebrate in a very real sense, you see. That means like, okay, in my funeral, I would want like, people to laugh, to be happy, to cry, to curse me, to, say everything, because that's what it should be, I feel. And about the calcification part is I've gone to some funerals where it's all somber and, oh, this is such a bad thing and all that. And I feel that that's like kind of reflective also of that isn't necessary. I won't say it's dishonest, but I would say it's definitely not dishonest, but I would say that it's not comprehensive to the totality of the death experience, which, goes hand in hand with a celebration of life, you see. Of course, we're all going to be sad that someone is gone. That's natural. We can't help that. But I think what we can help is to celebrate, that it's a good thing beyond our own loss. What about this person who's died? We will inevitably kind of believe that the person has gone to a better place, you know what I mean? So as much as I feel ritual in the sense of coming from the past is important, I feel that moving forward into the future, it's important for us to construct our rituals with a new kind of verve and then spark. Because I think once we hit the numinous world in a very deep sense, at least this is my experience, I find that all rituals and almost all rituals and pretty much all religions make sense to me on a very deep level.
What Jung made this comment in this passage that I read about how we don't understand these things anymore. And I think that's largely true, that people understood them in the past, and we don't understand them anymore because we've let the logos chip away at all these things. So we no longer really understand what it's doing for us. But, I can tell you with absolute certainty that when I was 30 years old and a deacon in the local Reformed church in Greece, New York, I didn't understand it. I really didn't understand it. And the big reason that I was being a deacon was because I was a young lawyer and I wanted to be recognized in the community as a young lawyer that was a responsible person. But there's no doubt that every week when I went to church and having gone through the ritual, I felt better at the end of it. And it's something that's unconscious that the ritual does, that, you know, I can't entirely put my finger on, but in terms of experience, a real experience, a psychological experience, it certainly made me have a fuller life. Okay, and
Yeah.
Sorry, just one clarification. Just now when I said that, you know, we should keep 60% and, you know, 40% we should chuck out. Okay, I don't mean that we should chuck out 40%. I think more precisely what I mean is that there is so much that we bring to ritual, which is actually baggage, which precludes us from, you know, just getting it and treating the ritual right. So I think that's what I mean by the 40%. That means that it's not so much that we throw away ritual, because I believe that we can't anyway. It will catch up with us one way or another. But I mean that, you know, instead of like, as Skip would probably say, John Viveking it, and, you know, is this real? Is that real? Is this left? Is that right? What does the cross mean? Instead of that, that's the 40%. I mean, chuck that out and you know, create a new one and put your energy there. That's what I mean. I don't mean throw away ritual, but I mean get rid of that baggage or you know, the bickering or the wondering about the ritual that you're actually going to do anyway. That puts you a distance from it. That's what I meant. Yeah.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and I would also say I've created a lot of rituals in my life, and the thing that's important about it is that you connect it with something meaningful. It doesn't have to be a particular kind of thing, and a ritual is best if it's simple and not extremely complicated. You don't have to invent, you know, a whole mass, for instance. But if you wanted to do a ritual that helps you signify something in your life, you can just make up something and say, okay, I'm gonna put this fruit on this altar as an act of devotion for, you know, the divine in my life, or something like that. And you can just declare for yourself what the meaning of that is. And as long as it has that meaning for you, it will have an impact, even if it's not a ritual that is shared throughout history.
Well, I don't think you have to declare that it has any given meaning. Okay. In other words, I couldn't even begin to tell you what the meaning of this is to me. I mean, I can tell you that the first time I saw it, it immobilized me for an hour. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't take off my coat. And what passed through my mind at that time, I don't know, I could fill volumes with it, but I wouldn't try. And so in a way, this is my ritual. Okay. I don't have a cross. I don't think I have a cross in my room. I might have one on a Bible somewhere, but I don't have a cross in my room. But this is so meaningful to me because to me, in part, it's about the fact that Mary understood that the material world had nothing to do with her son. Okay. The material world had nothing to do with her son. And she knew that he would live forever. And so giving away the nails, giving back the nails is, I have no need for this anymore because this doesn't have anything to do with my son anymore. And, you know, at the same time, I have another piece that I have right next to Mary, and that's my piece with me and Lana together, and Lana's painting, which actually is directly up. If I look up, I have the whole painting, but here it is when we had it at the U.S. Congress last summer. And I can't even begin to tell you what that painting means to me. It's the name of the painting is The Mother of the Martyr Kept the Governor Waiting at the Peace Conference. That's the name of the painting. And you can see the Mother of the Martyr there. If I get it up close, I guess you can see that. It's not as easy to understand the painting through the video, but again, it is a ritual for me to have it on my desk because it always reminds me.
Hi, Skip. Can you please describe in a few sentences how the painting is, like what it describes? Because a few times I have tried, I have not been able to perceive through my eyes. Just the video quality.
Let me see if I can show it to you.
Thank you.
I'm going to, wait a minute. Give me a moment. I have to take off my cloaking here.
Incidentally,
right. So there you can see Tim and Nicole
Yes.
on now, but right above my computer is this painting.
Oh, yeah.
Can you get a better appreciation for it now?
Yeah, and the eyes speak volumes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, everything speaks volumes
Yeah.
about it.
Self-portrait that she did of herself, right?
No. It's not a self-portrait.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's the mother. It's her mother.
It's the mother of the martyr. It's a mother of a martyr.
Mother. Oh, her mother. Interesting.
Yeah. And
they're similar, those two artworks.
Yeah.
The painting and the sculpture. They're linked.
That's right. They're both mothers of martyrs.
Is the sculpture, is the postcard of the sculpture, is that a picture of a postcard? Is that a postcard of an artwork that Tim did, or is that a postcard of somebody else's artwork? I'm trying to work it out.
No. It's a postcard of an artwork that Tim did.
Right. Yeah, wow. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm interested.
I'll have to send you one.
Yeah, look, it looks like she's got a pistol, like a rifle, is it? Or what is it?
No, she's got 4 nails in her hand. She's handing the 4 nails.
Holding her arm out. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So it's returning the nails to the Roman authorities.
Yeah, that resonates because I nailed a lot of the that's really weird because I nailed a lot of the structure of my house in myself. Then I got kicked out.
Yeah, well, I'll read what Tim said originally.
Yeah, right.
He said, it said that the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Chinese government sent bills to the families of the protesters for the cost of their execution. Whether true or not, this is the cast of human evil.
Yeah.
I'm researching early metallurgy, and I discovered that in Christ's time, iron was a strategic material. I imagine if nails were used for crucifixions, the families of the victims would be charged with returning the nails to the government. This image is Mary post-crucifixion. Peace.
right. Yeah.
I don't think they ever mail anything to the families. I'm from China. I was in China when they actually funny thing is my sister worked at the Tiananmen Square during the
Really?
hunger strike. Yeah.
Wow.
And then she came to United States for PhD. And the interesting part is that a lot of people get green card because of this June 4th. And most people have nothing to do with the Tiananmen Square, and my sister didn't get any benefit. Luckily, my uncle actually went there, bring her back just a couple of days before they had the crackdown.
Wow.
So she didn't really, she was there just before that happened. So she's pretty lucky.
Wow. That's amazing.
And is she in the United States now, Jing?
Yeah, she's in DC. She came here for PhD, then she worked at FDA now.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
The interesting thing is when I went back to work in China about 5 years ago, it so surprised me because I was third grade in high school. So just before, so I couldn't join because I was in high school. But our teacher at the beginning was very excited. We actually discussed about it. We tried to do something. But then one day everything changed, you know, it's become from very supportive to suddenly crack down. And it's the funny thing is then they don't report anything, you know, on the media. And I thought I never expect, when I went back to China, I talked to the younger people, nobody even know about it.
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's like, at first I thought, how can they do this? I said, people knows about it. But then I realized how powerful it is. Just like there's a woman writer from Taiwan called Long Ying Tai. I don't know if you guys heard about her. She actually lives in Germany, and she's writing about this collective memory people choose to forget at different countries. Like she read about in either Germany or some other country, like they have killed so many people and buried them, and then there's no report, nothing. Then everybody forgot about it.
Yeah.
It's amazing how people can easily choose to forget things.
Yeah. Well, Jing, we'll have to be careful about what we say to Heiyang Shen on Saturday night.
Yeah.
I think he's practicing in. I know he's practicing in China. I'm not sure it's Beijing. We have to ask him, and I haven't asked him yet. But
I know it's getting more. You know, when I came here in 1997, I think during the time before I come here, it's much more open, the country, you know, in every aspect. Now it's getting much more conservative, you know, so it feels like it's more going back to cultural revolution. So I'm very disappointed with this whole system, you know, like, and people are so easily brainwashed, and you cannot believe, like I was talking with one of my college classmates, her husband is very famous lawyer, her father-in-law too. And she said her son studying college, they study Marxism. And so, you know, Ma Yun, the Alibaba's owner, one time talked about capitalism. There's young people criticize him, said, you know, this is all, you know, extreme capitalism. We should learn from Karl Marx, you know, all this stuff. And I was like, the only country really did communist very well is North Europe. None of them. I think they're the country who really apply communist idea. You know, I think the young people are so easily being used by this government, you know, like brainwashed, and they think they have this communist idea, which is just like so stupid. Anyway, I was like criticize them, then my friend got very upset. They said the young people have their own judgment. I said, don't let them be used by government, because I don't think any of the country are doing the communist, you know, either China or other country. Just use it as excuse to do the feudalism, whatever, you know, central control. Not real communist.
Yeah, and Right. Well, what I found in my time that China is the most capitalistic country I've ever
I know.
seen. Okay. And I recall of course, I've had long experiences with China. And I remember about, well, probably 35 or 40 years ago now, China decided to, at one point, to open up private industry to average people. At the time, there were, I think, 4 million street vendors, mainly in China at the time. And they obviously were licensed to work and so on. But so the Chinese government decided that they would open private business to anybody, okay? And they did it on, let's say, a June 1st, and by June 30th, they had over 12 million applications. And so they shut it back down because they didn't know what the consequences were going to be. And so I've always seen that the Chinese people have always been the most capitalistic people I've ever run into. But, you know,
Yeah, I think the younger generation really have no, since June 4th, I think our generation still have some dreams, we want to change the world, all these grand ideas. But after us, everything is about money. There are more young people, they're more about making money. Money is everything. It's crazy, it's like no idealistic in the, in the system anymore. The system create people with pure capitalist idea.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, as Bapu says, as well, Mahatma Gandhi said, throughout history, there have been many tyrants, and for a time, they can seem very strong, but in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always. And so, the repressive system that is currently used by the government in Beijing cannot survive.
I think the coronavirus actually really helps to reveal that, because before that, I think people didn't realize the danger, and I think these things really show people how dangerous it is, because part of the reason is covered up and they make it so serious. And also, I think the government have so much power. They use the capitalist system. They actually have so much control of the world now. Like the British, the Italy, they all buy out. Even Japan, because the Japan is heavily rely on Chinese tourists for the economy. So every country, they use the capitalist system to, apply to all the other country and have much more control of the world now. It's pretty scary. Think about that,
Oh, it's very scary when we get all our pharmaceuticals from China or India. I remember 35 years ago when somebody announced that there weren't going to be any more boot makers in the U.S. and that all combat boots worn by Marines and our troops would be made overseas. And I thinking to myself, what could possibly go wrong with that? And
Say, Skip, we're closing in on 3 hours. I wonder if we should wrap it up.
yeah, let's wrap it up. By the way, Nancy has been here with us for most of the time, I think. And of course, she says symbols touch us deeply. She's been having problems with her eye and her eyes, and she's been having some treatments on them. But I hope you'll be back with us soon, Nancy. And thank you all on YouTube for following us this evening. We will be back tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a global check-in, and during that global check-in, I'm going to talk about the numinous events around Khushbu's and my work with the Bhagavad-Gita, and I hope that Khushbu will contribute. And Khushbu, do you have any final thoughts here? It might be late enough for you to have
Woken up.
yeah.
I want to talk a little bit just about the racial Tim mentioned, because I grew up in a country we have no religion, no racial. So I actually, I found actually when I'm here, like we don't really celebrate, Thanksgiving. I think America is all about ritual actually,
Yeah,
Thanksgiving, like Christmas, it keeps you busy. Like I'm so busy, I have to set up the house with all the decorations. Some people really enjoy it, and they also get it from the families. I have to start from scratch, keep me too busy to set it up. But I realize there's a value about it. But I realized I grew up in a culture, there's nothing, no history, because it all destroyed during cultural revolution. But I think people still have the same, they have no religion, no ritual, but people still have the same kind of value about what is good, what is bad. I go to church a lot because I recognize there's a lot of valuable things. But I don't think church makes people better people. You can still be a nice people deep inside without following any religion. I think people have this shared value, they may burn with. You're always from society. I don't know where it's from, but people know what's good, what's bad, what they're supposed to do, even without religion.
Right.
Unless it was repressed by the politics. Otherwise, people have this natural way to doing those things.
Yeah. Okay, we won't put Khushbu on the spot here tonight, but I hope we'll see her tomorrow. And I'm sorry, Nicole, that the session tomorrow is going to be at 3 in the morning for you. You can pass. That's all right.
It's been great.
But
Really
just a reminder that on Saturday it will be at 10 a.m. your time. On Sunday, it's 10 p.m. my time and 8 p.m. Tim's time and 7 p.m. Jing's time. But for you and Nick, for you it's going to be noon, and for Nick it's going to be 10 in the morning.
Oh, cool.
And for Khushbu it's 7:30 in the morning. So I'm talking about the night of May 30th. We have Dr. Haeyong Shen, who's one of the authors in Jung's Red Book for Our Time, who will be talking to us specifically about why the Red Book is read, quote unquote. That's the title. That's part of the title of his story. And he's also going to tell us how a man in China becomes a Jungian analyst in China. And that should be a very interesting evening. And I am working on getting somebody for Thursday, but at the moment I haven't got that quite nailed down yet. So we'll see so as it stands now, unless I send out an email, there's nothing scheduled Thursday, but Saturday there is. And I'm sorry for those that got confused this past Saturday, because I was just exhausted and had to have a break. So, okay.
Right. Thanks, everybody.
See you next week. And Nancy, maybe we'll finish up Memory Streams Reflections next week. I hope so. So we'll make that a priority first. And Idris is giving us a pointer to Life and Death in Shanghai, a book by Nian Chang is the correct name. And you'll have to check back on the chat on that. So thank you, and thanks to everyone on YouTube who's been with us for the evening. See you tomorrow.
you.
Tomorrow,
Okay.
1
Thanks,
o'clock.
everyone.
Peace.
Bye,
Take care.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.